So, we are starting with our annual G20 address. May I please request everyone to settle down, please? So, may I please request everyone to settle down? We're just about to start. So, we have moved to the last session of the first day of this conference, which is the much awaited annual G20 address, which is on cryptocurrencies and blockchains. What is the right approach? And the address will be delivered by Usha Thorat, who's the former Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank of India. And to chair this talk, we have Montek Singh Ahluwalia, who's the former Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, Government of India. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, I have a very easy task. I just have to thank the organizers for inviting me to this meeting and to very briefly introduce Usha. Now, I think you've been given a very impressive document here, which contains a very detailed statement of all her many achievements. I'll just mention that I first got to know her before she became Deputy Governor. I think in that time she was actually responsible for placement of foreign exchange and managing our reserves and did a very good job at that time. And since then she's been a banker, she's been Deputy Governor, she went and became head of Kafral, and then is slowly extricating herself from the banking world. Now, I don't know whether this is a consequence of the decline of prestige of the financial sector after 2008. But you know, when I met her, she said, don't mention any of this banking. I'm really into NGO activity. So clearly, I should really introduce her as a latter-day star of the NGO world, which is what she wanted. However, the reason I actually agreed to come, other than a mild affection for the G20, with which I've been associated for a long time in different capacities, was that I really don't know anything, or nearly not as much as I think I should, about cryptocurrencies and blockchains. So when I was told that Usha Thorat is going to explain all this, I said, oh great, then I'm going to come and listen carefully. So I would advise you to sit back and listen carefully, and then of course you can tear her apart if there is time for questions. So with those words, Usha, it's all yours.
Good evening, everyone. Great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much, Rajat, for inviting me for this talk. I really don't know why you chose me, since I've not spoken about it, not written about it, nothing other than having been a former deputy governor, I suppose, and in charge of currency. And thank you, Montek, for making me more nervous than I already was. Also realizing that this is a pre-dinner address, I tried my best to see how to liven it up. So I do have quite a few cartoons on crypto, so that can probably keep you amused while you're looking at the more hard stuff. Extremely happy really to be in this audience, and the subject is cryptocurrency and blockchain. What is the right approach? And as I understand, this is an area where the G20 is actually, going to spend in the November meet, the Argentinian presidency. And so in that respect, it becomes a matter for an importance for this conference. It also is sort of getting the attention of countries who are going through sanctions or who are going through turbulence, and there are other interests which are coming in cryptocurrency. So maybe all that, and there may be quite a few people in the audience here who probably know more about the subject than I. So the outline of the presentation, we'll just try and understand what is cryptocurrency, the definition, its features, the legal position and the extent of usage, the pros and cons. What is the view taken by the global central banks, regulators, G20? What is a central bank digital currency? And then we go on to blockchain technology, the implications and its potential, what has been the approach in India, and finally looking forward. So obviously, we don't want to be left behind. We don't want to be left behind in even in understanding what is blockchain and what is cryptocurrency. It's a digital currency, digital as opposed to physical, in which encryption techniques are used to regulate the generation of units of currency and verify the transfer, operating independently of a central bank. So the way we understand currency and money is, it is a liability of the central bank and money is a liability of the banking system. But here you're dealing with money which is not a liability either of the state or a monetary authority or a central bank. It is based on the blockchain technology, and therefore there is a distributed ledger. It does not have a central authority. That keeps an overview of the cryptocurrency and the ownership. It defines, it's a protocol, it's a consensus amongst the users, define how and when new cryptocurrency units can be created. Currently, only 21 billion bitcoins can be mined. Ownership of cryptocurrency can be proved exclusively, cryptographically, allows transactions to be performed and the ownership to be changed. And once a currency transaction is done, then it is irreversible. And it's sort of, they get validated at every step and get added on as a block to the whole blockchain. So it was only in 2018 that the word cryptocurrency was added to the dictionary. So how this works is that on the left side of the slide, you have how a blockchain works. Someone requests for a transaction. Then that transaction request is broadcast to a peer-to-peer network consisting of computers known as nodes. Then the network of nodes, anyone in that network can validate the transaction, and the first one to validate it, in fact, gets a payment for it, basing the agreed algorithm. Then the verified transaction this is a blockchain technology, can involve a cryptocurrency, or it can even involve contracts or records or other information. And then once it's verified, the transaction is combined with other transactions to create a new block of data for the ledger. So it's added to the existing block in a way that is permanent and unalterable. So the left side of the screen really gives you the whole process, and the right side just talks about the cryptocurrency, which has no intrinsic value in that it is not redeemable for any other commodity such as gold. It has no physical form, and its supply is not determined by a central bank. The network is completely decentralized. What is the legal status of Bitcoin? Interestingly, this slide actually gives you the fact that in many parts of the world, it is permissive to use Bitcoin, but it hasn't been given a kind of a legal tender status. In some countries, it's contentious, like in India, it is contentious, China, on the restrictions there are on the usage of Bitcoin. And earlier this year, there was actually a ban on banks giving any kind of services to people who are dealing in bitcoins. And in certain parts of the world, it's quite contentious, and in certain parts, it's quite hostile. So you do have a variety, and you have a picture here of Venezuela, and I'm happy that the ambassador to Venezuela is here, and maybe he can share why they consider bitcoins to be quite important. When you look at the usage of bitcoins, I know in terms of market capitalization it's become really big, but when you look at the usage of bitcoins, active Bitcoin users are 5.8 million. And it is really not all that much when you compare it to other users of payment systems like PayPal or MasterCard or Visa or Alipay, the two Chinese, the Tencent and Ant, that is the Alipay one, which goes to almost 1 billion users. But the fact is that it has attracted a lot of interest, and in 2017 is when it really became extremely interesting to a whole lot of people who started dabbling in Bitcoin. Interestingly, when I first heard of Bitcoin was actually in 2011, when my daughter's friend was visiting us from London, and he was with his wife and small kid. And then he had this little contraption like a mobile phone, and he said, I have to go to a nearby town, because we were in Kolhapur, and he said, I'm going to Meerut because I want to encash some of my bitcoins. I was really curious to know what on earth was he going to do, where was he going to get it from, and immediately all the questions started, and I tried to look at that instrument which he had to see exactly what was what was behind it. Then he explained to me, and of course I couldn't understand the concept at all. But he did manage to finance his entire trip with bitcoins. And he successfully exchanged. He got the money. He had also gained some high rate of return by using those bitcoins. And just about 3-4 months ago, there was a gentleman sitting next to me in the flight. And he was very anxious. He saw me reading all the financial parts of the newspapers. And he said, I just want to ask you, I've seen you engrossed in all this, so, who are you and all that. And then he said, see, I put some money in bitcoins in a Gujarat exchange, and now I'm not allowed to remove it. What is going to happen to my money? This is after the Reserve Bank ban had come. I said, why did you do that? He said, no, I think it's a great thing, and I'm completely sold on this. A very youngster who he's a shippy, and he was, outside, and then I realized that it's not all there in theory. It's all happening all around us. So what are the advantages? Clearly, some people who used it find it it's completely decentralized. And there are some people who don't believe in any authority, don't believe in any state authorities. They'd rather be in a system which just was based on mutual trust and not based on trust on any state or any central bank or any central authority. It's tax-free, it's low cost, it's fast. It's private and it's secure. It cannot be altered. It's irreversible. So if 2 transactions happen, it just won't allow the wrong transaction to happen. There's no intermediation, which means you put money into it. That money is not given to anybody else as a loan. It just remains there. No counterfeiting possible. It can facilitate access, universal access, because it's very easy to open an account and then transfer money. It can be traded. It's also a source of earning for people who, validate the transaction and work with the protocol, and they can mine the currency, the cryptocurrency. What are the cons? The most important one, I think, is that it cannot scale like sovereign money. Sovereign money, you can create money and you can reduce money and you can increase money, but in case of bitcoins and cryptocurrency, that's not the way it does. Every currency, every transaction is validated and it's acquired and disacquired. The value is extremely unstable, and that has been the experience from $400, $17,000 down, boom. It's been going all over the place. It's got a lot of connections. I think the events in the dark areas do affect the Silk Route, and various other events have affected the value of the Bitcoin. So its use as a store of value and a unit of account, 2 very, very important characteristics of money, do not seem to be there because of its volatility in nature and because of the speculative element in transacting in Bitcoin. And the finality of payment is not guaranteed, obviously, by any authority. And there is a lot of illegal uses of Bitcoin because of the anonymity. There is a possibility of hacking, and there have been instances. There have been also problems of forking. Forking is actually a system where there is a new protocol which replaces an existing protocol. And if something is then done using the new protocol, there could be a kind of a complication in the settlement. Apart from it being extremely, we were discussing this after the discussion on climate change, and we discussed about how servers consume absolutely hog electricity, and this is very energy intensive, very CPU intensive. The other aspect of Bitcoins is not just that third parties like exchanges are unavoidable eventually, because if you can't be having everywhere an outlet for Bitcoin. And so bringing in, if you wanted to eliminate third parties, but then you'd have to bring them in because of the exchanges, and hence there can be a security aspect as well. Legal status is not certain, like we mentioned. It's hard to understand, but it definitely lures people into speculating because they find people having grown rich in a very short period of time. And so you can see how these pictures, which of this is really Bitcoin? That's the forking problem. Now, obviously, the regulators have been enormously challenged by this creature, and regulators and central banks have actually been studying this subject for a long time. Here it says, what is worrying you? It is Bitcoin that worries me as the central bank governor, it says. So the one clearly is the anti-money laundering and the combating and financing the CFT laws. How does this is it going to threaten this even more? Is it going to be impossible to deal with it? What kind of consumer and investor protection issues are going to be involved, including the hacking, the security, the number of people, whether they are going to get their value, the vulnerability, because more and more people are coming and investing it from speculative point of view, and if it's going to really become a Ponzi. And what could be the new financial vulnerabilities and systemic risk that could possibly arise out of more and more people, getting into this cryptocurrencies. So one clearly is that this doesn't define any national boundaries. Bitcoins and cryptocurrencies don't have any national boundaries. So therefore, it doesn't really come under any single regulator. It will have to be a cooperation amongst regulators, and there have to be a total redrawing of regulatory jurisdiction. The tax and capital treatment rules clearly would be very important, and these would also have to be coordinated and consensus arrived at. Maximum, the regulation could also target institutions offering services specific to cryptocurrencies, and this is exactly what Reserve Bank did earlier this year, when the banks who were offering services to some of these cryptocurrency exchanges and some of their wallets they withdrew that facility. And whatever laws are applicable and whatever regulations are applicable to payment services, they would have to be then adapted to cryptocurrency. So these could be certain approaches in which the regulators can move forward, but this is in general. But fundamentally, I think the thought that is currently on is that there are significant issues that crypto assets raise with respect to consumer and investor protection, tax evasion, money laundering, and it's also true that they lack the key attributes of sovereign currencies. They don't seem to serve the purpose of a store of value or a means of exchange or a unit of account. And while at this point of time they do not pose a global financial stability risk, there is need to remain vigilant, and the FSB report yesterday also has come out with the same conclusion that there are a number of areas which need to be continuously monitored because there is a huge speed of development and there are huge data gaps. So unless the G20 and the FSB continuously monitor all these developments, it's possible that we won't even know what is happening. So that's the current status on the G20 view. The IMF view, interestingly, I think it was Lagarde who really was sort of a little more positive about the cryptocurrency, recognizing the technology's value. She said that we shouldn't really be complacent. We should understand what central banks are really, how they are doing their jobs and are they doing it well. But at the same time, whatever the technological, whatever the defects are of the cryptocurrency, we should be able to work on them and use technological innovation to address these deficiencies. And that was really what she said. Otherwise, the general view is that they don't have the same degree of trust that people have in fiat currencies. They are afflicted by notorious cases of fraud and security breaches, but ultimately the usage, starts revealing the trust that people have in it. And whether there is a potential competitive pressure from cryptocurrencies, the IMF says central banks must continue to carry out effective monetary policies. And they can also learn from the properties of cryptocurrencies and the underlying technology and make fiat currencies more attractive for the digital age. So this gives us a clue of countries where there is rampant hyperinflation, or countries where the trust of the people in the local currency is not high, or where the trust of the people in the financial system is not good. Then there is a preference to use such a asset for holding it as a store of value and also exchange it. So that explains maybe in certain jurisdictions, and maybe Venezuela would explain to us that a little better. The BIS view is, of course, I think Carsten's was very, very, he said it's a combination of a bubble, a Ponzi game, and an environmental disaster. And it was completely, in his address earlier this year and also in the BIS annual report, said that it's looking beyond the hype. It is hard to identify a specific economic problem which they currently solve. Transactions are slow and costly, prone to congestion. They cannot scale with demand. Decentralized consensus behind the technology is also fragile, consumes enormous amount of power. Distributed ledger technology can have promise in other applications. Policy responses need to prevent abuses while allowing further experimentation. Whether it's a bubble, whether it's a Ponzi, whether it's an environmental disaster, it is true that as a means of payment, it doesn't seem to have worked that well. Therefore, some central banks are seriously looking at what is known as central bank digital currency. Clearly, if you can have a central bank digital currency, then the whole aspect of putting currency into circulation, taking it out, counterfeiting, all this could be quite easily handled. It will probably be very useful. But what kind of a digital currency then are we really looking at? There could be two kinds. There could be a general purpose central bank digital currency, which means that every person could be having a node, every consumer and every firm. Or it could be just a wholesale central bank digital currencies, which are only available to institutional investors, which would be like those having central banking reserves, in other words, banks. So you're just replacing the existing system with nodal membership, which is not a centrally cleared system, but which is a distributed ledger kind of a system, and it can enhance the settlement efficiency for transactions which involve securities and derivatives and so on. But the real discussion here, I think, is on the general purpose CBDC, whether the central bank digital currency is something that an ordinary person in the street can hold, and in what form. Is it going to be in a form of a card, or is it going to be in a smartphone? And is it something that means that if the central bank is issuing, is having this digital currency, then what's going to be the implication of intermediation and the role of savings and money supply and money creation? Is it something that could become, threaten the very existence of money, monetary supply? It has a huge amount of implications for all aspects that central banks really deal with. So, and is it really necessary to do this if there are private retail payment systems which are already in place, which are doing it very efficiently? How would that work? Finally, what if if this is something that is held cross-border? Is it going to lead to huge kind of transactions which would be very difficult to control, make all the cross-border controls, the payments and transfers extremely easy, and then increase the vulnerabilities. And there could be all this instability of, like what we said about commercial bank deposit funding. Would there be intermediation at all? These are opening up a whole lot of issues which are at the fundamental for this whole, blockchain technology itself. Does it really threaten finance as we understand it today? In India, interest really started last year when there was a huge increase in price. There was a public interest litigation in November 2017, which said that this is against the public interest. In the budget, the government said it did not consider cryptocurrencies as legal tender. They would do anything to eliminate the creation of crypto assets. In April, RBI asked entities regulated by it to terminate their business relationship with firms and individuals dealing in cryptocurrencies. Supreme Court did not grant any relief to the people who challenged the Reserve Bank ban, and the Supreme Court hearing has still not taken place. I understand there is an internal group which is looking into central bank digital currency. There have been a few exchanges, quite a few in Gujarat, I was told, which were dealing with it, and some of the banks had provided some facilities to it, which have now been withdrawn. So that is the status where we are on cryptocurrencies in India at present. While there is a lot, central banks and regulators are not comfortable at all about cryptocurrencies, certainly blockchain technology is perceived to be having significant applications, not only in the world of finance, but also in various other areas, including supply chain management areas. So it's the same thing. We saw that earlier block, how do they get created? Each block contains a cryptographic of the previous block. It has a timestamp and it has a transaction date. So there is an open distributed ledger that will record transactions between two parties efficiently in a verifiable and permanent way, managed by a peer-to-peer network. The network can be permissioned or not permissioned. So access can be uniquely identified with an identification such as a KYC, etc., but it can also be completely anonymous. But in the case of blockchain applications, obviously it would be something that every node would have to be identified. And there would be a protocol which would come in regular intervals, which will be for validating the new blocks. The same principle of not altering retroactively without alteration of the subsequent blocks. So therefore, you require the consent of the network majority. So this blockchain technology, it's found, has got enormous number of applications. Like I said, not only in finance, but also in the other areas. One is it could make cross-border payments very easy. And today it's quite fair to say that cross-border payments, which are, remittances, and that is one reason, for example, why Philippines has encouraged this kind of inward remittances, because the existing formal methods of payments don't seem to be that low cost. It still is quite expensive to transfer across borders, and there is a possibility that using this technology, the cross-border payments could become quite fast and safe. So that's one area where one would have to examine it. Another area which seems quite an interesting threat to, in fact, I would say markets, stock markets, clearing corporations, depositories, custodians. If there is a complete node-to-node ability to trade and settle, then perhaps one eliminates all the intermediaries involved in security market transactions. It seems like almost a very, to visualize such a thing when we know the financial markets and systems as we do. But this is the kind of challenges that this technology is really posing. Would central counterparties, and I happen to head the Clearing Corporation of India, which is the wholesale central counterparty for settlement of foreign exchange, government securities, and some of the derivative transactions on foreign exchange and money markets. Therefore, we have started looking at whether this technology is something that the Clearing Corporation of India has to study and understand. So far, looking at what's been happening and the kind of research that's going on globally, it doesn't seem to be the case that it's going to be in any way more efficient or safer or lower cost than the existing. But having said that, technology is something that really, is changing and growing very rapidly, and things do change enormously. And it's quite possible that this kind of traditional way that we've been looking at trading and markets and is something that can possibly be replaced, or maybe depositories and clearinghouses themselves may start adopting this technology while giving the comfort of having a solid institution behind it. And maybe that's the area where path where organizations such as ours maybe need to go. Another